45 head of swine, all of them past prime, half of them lame. Harlan Creed's voice carried across the whole auction yard, loud enough so every man within 50 feet could hear. He wasn't talking to anyone in particular. That was the point. He was performing, and the buyer is that woman. He let the pause sit there like something rotten. Laughter moved through the crowd in a wave, the kind of laughter that isn't really about anything being funny. Mara Voss stood at the gate with her receipt in her hand, 45 Sows, shifting and grunting behind the wooden rails, and she heard every word. She didn't turn around. She just folded the receipt, tucked it into her coat pocket, and began walking toward the animals that everyone in Red Creek had already written off, just like they'd written off her. If this story moves something in you, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop a like. Leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the morning everything changed. The auctions had started before sunrise. That was the way of it in Red Creek. The serious livestock business happened in the cold. Before the light got good, when the men who knew animals could see their breath in the air and watch the way a hog moved without the distraction of a crowd, working itself into theater. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline and threw thin gold across the stockyard pens, most of the decent breeding stock had already changed hands. The serious bidders had their animals loaded and were thinking about breakfast. What remained were the animals nobody wanted. Pen 7 held 45 sows, all of them older. Most of them past what the county's practical livestock wisdom considered productive years. A few had bad hips. One had a torn ear that hadn't healed right. Their coats were rough from a hard season, their bodies carrying the kind of deep, settled weight that comes from years of living, rather than months of forced feeding. To the ranchers and farmers who'd already spent their money on the younger stock, these animals represent a problem. The cost of feeding them through winter would outrun whatever you might get from their remaining productivity. The math didn't work. Everyone agreed on that. Harlan Creed had walked the length of pen 7 twice that morning, making a show of it, letting men see him look and then look away. Harlan was 53 years old, built like a man who'd never missed a meal and never intended to, with a rancher's tan that stopped at the collar and a reputation in the county. That he maintained the way some men maintain a fence line constantly, aggressively, and with a clear sense of what belonged on his side of it. He ran the largest hog operation in 3 counties. He knew pigs. He also knew, with the particular confidence of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything in public, that those 45 sows in pen 7 were a dead investment. He'd said so loudly to 3 different men before 8 o'clock. So when Mara Voss walked up to the auctioneer's table and placed her bid methodical, quiet, her big hand writing the number down on the slip of paper without any visible hesitation, Harlan noticed. The men around him noticed. The auctioneer, a leathery man named Dob Purvis, who had been calling livestock sales in this county for 30 years, noticed too, though he had the professional dignity not to show it. Mara was 29 years old. She was a large woman, tall and heavy-bodied, with broad shoulders and hands that had been working since she was old enough to follow her father through the morning chores. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw, and she'd inherited the hill farm north of town 6 months ago when Emmett Voss died of a chest illness that had been working on him for 2 winters before it finally finished the job. The farm was 80 acres of rocky hillside, oak forest, and creek bottom, with a stone farmhouse, 3 aging outbuildings, and a smokehouse that hadn't been fired in nearly a decade. It also had debt. Not catastrophic debt, but the grinding, patient kind, the kind that doesn't threaten to swallow you whole on any given day, but simply stays there at the edge of everything, reminding you that the margin between managing and failing is thinner than it looks. Everyone in Red Creek knew about the debt. In a town that size, everyone knew everything, or believed they did. What they knew about Mara specifically was this: she was unmarried, which at 29 carries a certain weight of opinion in that community. She was large, which carried a different kind of weight, mostly the kind people assigned to her without her asking. Most of its windows were dark, considered an eccentric, a man with too many theories and not enough conventional sense, which was the charitable version of what people said about Emmett Voss. The less charitable version was that he'd spent 20 years chasing ideas that went nowhere and left his daughter a farm with more problems than assets. And now here she was, bidding on 45 sows that every experienced man in the yard had already decided were worthless. Harlan Creed waited until Dob Purvis could sail. Then he made his comment, loud and carrying to no one and everyone. Mara heard it. She heard the laughter that followed it. She felt the specific quality of that laughter, not mean-spirited exactly, but comfortable, the laughter of people who already know how the story ends and find the confirmation satisfying. She kept her face neutral. She had learned that particular skill early, growing up the size she was in a place where people felt entitled to observations about her body the way they felt entitled to observations about the weather, as though it were a public matter, subject to open commentary. She folded her receipt. She put it in her pocket. She walked to pen 7 and began the work of moving 45 sows out of the auction yard. It took her most of the morning. The drive back to the farm was 4 miles on a dirt road that had not been graded since the previous spring, which meant ruts and loose stone and one low creek crossing that the Sows didn't want to take and had to be convinced of, individually and with considerable patience. Mara had borrowed a neighbor's dog, an old border collie named Patch, who was past his best working years but still knew the job. The two of them moved the herd together, Mara on foot, because she couldn't afford to risk a horse getting injured on the uneven ground, Patch working the edges with the quiet competence of a dog who'd done this 1,000 times. By the time the farm came into view, the stone farmhouse gray-brown against the oak ridge, the outbuildings silvery with age, the empty pens waiting in the lower field, Mara's knees were aching, and her back had the particular tightness that came from hours of walking on uncertain ground. Her boots were wet from the creek crossing. Her coat was heavy with mud that had splashed up from the road. She stood at the gate and watched the sows move into the lower pasture, spreading out, testing the unfamiliar ground with the cautious intelligence that older animals develop. They were not beautiful. They were not impressive by any conventional standard. They were scarred and thick-bodied and slow in the way that years of living make you slow. She thought about her father. Emmett Voss had kept a notebook, a battered thing, with a cloth cover that he'd carried in his coat pocket for the last 15 years of his life. Most of it was observations, what the animals ate, how they moved, how the meat changed depending on what they'd been fed and how long they'd been allowed to grow. He'd had a theory, never fully tested, about mature hogs raised on forage acorns, fallen apples, the roots and grasses of open hillside producing meat that was fundamentally different from what the feedlots turned out. More complex, more flavorful, worth something different. He'd never gotten far enough with it to prove anything. The debt had always been there. The time had always run short. Mara had found the notebook 3 weeks after he died in the bottom drawer of his desk under a collection of seed catalogs from the 1870s. She'd read it twice through before she understood what she was looking at. Then she'd read it a third time. She wasn't a woman who made decisions quickly, but when she made them, they tended to hold. That evening, after the sows were settled and watered, and she'd checked each one for injury from the drive, Mara sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open and a piece of paper beside it where she'd been doing figures. The numbers were not comfortable reading. She had enough cash on hand to get through maybe 6 weeks at current feed costs, plus whatever she could bring in from selling vegetables through the late fall market. The bank note on the property was due in installments. The next one in 4 months. 4 months was not a long time. She looked at the notebook. She looked at her figures. She did not look away from either for a long time. The theory in the notebook depended on patience. The hogs had to be raised slowly, allowed to forage widely, finished on the best available feed over months rather than weeks. The smokehouse had to be functional, and it wasn't, not currently. The curing had to be done right, which meant learning things her father had only partially recorded and she had never done herself. It was possible that none of it would work. It was possible she would spend the winter pouring resources into 45 animals and emerge in the spring with nothing to show for it but exhausted savings and a note the bank would not extend again. Harlan Creed's voice came back to her, unbidden. The laughter came with it. She picked up her pen and went back to the figures. The first person she told about the plan was Nell Arden, who came by the following morning with a covered dish and the specific expression of a woman who has come to offer condolences disguised as a social call. Nell's was 41, a widow of 3 years, with a teenage daughter and a house that needed more repair than she could afford. She and Mara's mother had been close before Mara's mother passed, and Nell had a residual affection for the Voss family that she expressed through food and frank conversation. "People are talking," Nell said, setting the dish on the table. It was a beef stew. The gesture was kind and also slightly pointed. Nell was aware that Mara's pantry had been thin lately. "I know," Mara said. "Harlan Creed told my neighbor that you'd paid good money for 45 hogs that'll be dead before February." "He doesn't know what I paid." Mara poured 2 cups of coffee. "And he's wrong about February." Nell sat down and looked at her. Nell had the quality that some women develop through hard experience, the ability to hold a silence without filling it, to let the space between words carry weight. "What are you doing, Mara?" Mara set the notebook on the table. Nell read it slowly. She was not a farming woman by nature. She'd married a mill worker, and her hands were more accustomed to thread than soil, but she was intelligent and she understood enough to follow what Mara Voss had been working toward. When she finished, she looked up. "Your father never finished it." "No." "You think you can?" Mara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I think the animals are right. The property is right. The smokehouse can be restored." She paused. "I think he had the correct idea and the wrong timing. He never had enough animals and he never had enough season. I have both. And if it doesn't work?" The question sat between them. It was a fair question. It was the only question that actually mattered. "Then I'll have learned something," Mara said, which was not the whole of her answer, but it was the part she could say out loud without her voice changing. Nell looked at her for a long moment. Then she pushed the stew dish toward the center of the table. "Eat something while you tell me what you need." The smokehouse was the first problem. It was a stone structure about 15 feet square, built by Marshaw's grandfather, with the particular solidity of a man who believed in building things to outlast himself. The stone was sound. The mortar needed work in 3 places on the north wall. The interior racks had rotted through in several spots and needed replacing. The ventilation system, a series of adjustable flue openings in the upper walls, had seized up. 2 of the 4 vents frozen in place by a decade of disuse. Mara spent the first 2 weeks of October on the smokehouse. She rented a handcart from the feed store, bought lime and sand in small quantities she could afford, and learned to mix mortar from a pamphlet she'd sent away from an agricultural society 3 counties east. The first batch she mixed was too wet. The second was too dry. The third held, and she worked her way around the north wall in sections, her big hands pressing mortar into the gaps with careful thoroughness. The ventilation vents were harder. 2 of them required complete disassembly, pulling the iron fittings out of the stone, cleaning them with vinegar and wire brush, resetting them with new packing. She worked on them in the evenings by lantern light, her knuckles scraped, her back complaining from the day's labor, her fingers learning the feel of iron and stone through repetition. She broke 2 of her father's chisels before she found the right angle for the 3rd vent. She sat on the smokehouse floor and looked at the broken tools and made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something less dignified. Then she found a different chisel, sharpened it, and kept working. Nobody came to help. She hadn't asked anyone to. Meanwhile, the sows were adjusting to the hill farm in the particular way that older animals adjust to new ground slowly, with suspicion testing every boundary before accepting it. Mara was driving them up into the oak forest by the 2nd week, letting them range across the hillside where the acorns lay thick on the ground from a good mast year. She watched what they ate and what they left alone. She took notes in a nook she'd notebook for the purpose, recording what the notebook hadn't covered: the specific composition of the forage on this hillside, the way the animals' condition changed week to week, the early signs she was learning to read in their coats, and movement and appetite. The walking was hard on her. 4 miles a day on uneven ground, through brush and over rock, in boots that were already worn and would need replacing before winter. Her knees were a recurring conversation she had with herself each morning, negotiating what was necessary against what was comfortable and arriving at the same conclusion each time: necessary wins. She started leaving earlier to give herself more time on the steeper slopes. Red Creek noticed, of course. A woman of Mara's size was not an inconspicuous figure in a landscape. and the sight of her driving 45 sows across the Oak Ridge every morning became a piece of local commentary that several men found endlessly entertaining. The fat farm girl on her hog picnic was a phrase she heard secondhand from 3 different people in the space of 2 weeks, delivered each time with the particular gentleness of someone who wants you to know what's being said about you, while being able to claim they're only passing along information. Mara recorded it in no notebook. She filed it in the part of herself where she kept everything that had been said about her body since she was 11 years old, the place she'd learned to build with thick walls and no windows. The first real crisis came in the 3rd week of October. One of the sows, a gray-coated animal, Mara, had privately named Granite for her particular stubbornness when off her feed. In a younger animal, this might have been manageable. In an older one, already stressed from the drive and the change of environment, it was a warning sign that could escalate quickly. Mara sat with Granite in the lower pen for 2 hours that evening, watching her, checking her temperature, running her hands along the animal's sides, feeling for the subtle signs of illness that her father had described in the notebook. She found nothing obvious. No fever, no swelling, no external wound. She went back to the farmhouse and read through the notebook's medical sections twice. She mixed a mash of buttermilk and bran and brought it out at midnight, sitting in the dark pen with a lantern, waiting. Granite sniffed at the mash, turned away, sniffed again, and began slowly to eat. Mara sat back against the pen railing and breathed out. She stayed for another hour, not because it was necessary, but because the relief of it needed somewhere to go. The lantern burned low. The other sows moved in the dark around her, and the night was cold and quiet and smelled of oak leaves and turned earth. And somewhere in the middle of it, Mara put her face in her hands, not crying. Exactly. Though her eyes were wet and sat there for a while, being a 29-year-old woman alone on a hill farm with too much debt and too much to prove and one sick sow who had just decided to eat. Then she blew out the lantern, walked back to the house, and went to sleep. She was up before dawn, Nat. November arrived with a hard frost that silvered the grass and turned the creek crossing into something that required deliberate negotiation every morning. The oak forage began to thin as the trees finished their drop, and Mara shifted the feeding routine supplement with the windfall apples she'd spent 3 weeks collecting from the abandoned orchard on the east side of the property, storing them in the root cellar she'd cleared out in September, rationing them carefully against the long winter ahead. She'd also begun experimenting with the smokehouse. The first test batch was a disaster by any objective measure. She'd acquired 4 shoulders from a neighbor's hog, traded for 2 weeks of fence repair work, and tried to cure them using a salt and sulfur mix she'd calculated from her father's notes and a curing pamphlet from the same agricultural society. The salt concentration was wrong. The cure drew moisture unevenly. When she hung the shoulders in the smokehouse and lit the first fire, the temperature spiked too high because she hadn't yet learned how much wood her particular stack needed and how long it took the stone chamber to stabilize. The result was meat that was salty in some places, raw in others, and bitter from the smoke. She looked at it for a long time. She wrote detailed notes about everything that had gone wrong, with particular attention to the temperature curve and the salt measurements. Then she fed what she could salvage to the chickens and started the calculations for the next batch. The second batch was better in some ways and worse in others. The salt ratio was closer. The smoke temperature was more controlled. She'd spent 4 days doing test fires with small loads of wood, recording the temperature at 30-minute intervals, building a picture of how the chamber behaved. But the airflow through the vents still wasn't right, creating a smoked exterior that masked an interior she wasn't satisfied with. She adjusted the vent angles. She did 3 more test burns. She studied the color of the smoke, which her father had written about, in terms she was only beginning to understand from experience rather than theory. December was 6 weeks away. She had enough cash for another 8 weeks of operation, if she was careful. The banknote installment was in 10 weeks. She did not discuss this timeline with anyone. It was hers to carry. On a Saturday in mid-November, she drove into town for supplies and ran into Harlan Creed outside the feed store. He was coming out as she was going in, and the doorway was narrow enough that they had to acknowledge each other. Harlan looked at her. His expression was the particular kind of studied neutrality that men adopt when they've said something publicly they can't take back and are not yet ready to revise. Miss Voss, Mr. Creed. He glanced toward the wagon, where she had an empty crate that had held the week's egg sales. How are those sows getting on? Well, she said. One word, flat and complete. He nodded once, slowly, with the expression of a man filing information he doesn't yet know what to do with. Then he stepped aside and held the door open, which surprised her more than she showed. She went in and bought what she needed and drove back to the farm. That evening, she went to the smokehouse and lit a test fire and sat in the doorway, watching the smoke and thinking about nothing in particular, which was the closest she got to rest most days. The smoke was starting to look right. She didn't know yet what right meant, exactly. She was building her understanding from fragments, from her father's words and her own observation, and the particular education that comes only from repeated failure. But something in the color and the rise of it was beginning to match what she was reaching toward. She put her hand against the stone wall of the smokehouse. It was warm and solid, and it had been there for 60 years, and it would be there for 60 more. A little longer, she said to the smoke, or to herself, or to something she wouldn't name. Then she adjusted the south vent by a 1/4 inch and recorded the change in her notebook, and sat back down to watch what happened next. The 1/4 inch adjustment to the south vent turned out to matter more than Mara had expected. She discovered this 3 days later when she ran her 4th test burn, this time with a small load of hickory and a handful of dried apple wood she'd split from a fallen branch in the orchard. The smoke came up through the chamber with a different quality, slower, more even, spreading across the hanging space without the hot spots she'd been fighting since October. She stood inside the smokehouse with her hand at different heights, feeling the temperature variation. And for the first time since she'd started this, the numbers in her head lined up with what she was feeling in her palm. She wrote it down. Every detail. The wood ratio, the vent positions, the outside temperature that morning, the time it took the chamber to reach working temperature, how long it held before she needed to add fuel. She wrote until her hand cramped, and then she switched hands and kept writing, because her father had taught her that the difference between a theory and a practice was documentation, and she intended to turn his theory into something that could be repeated. What she hadn't told anyone, not Nell, not the neighbor who'd traded her the test shoulders, not anyone, was that the bank had sent a second letter. The first letter, 3 weeks after her father died, had been procedural. A statement of the remaining debt, the installment schedule, the contact information for the loan officer, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had an office above the dry goods store, and the particular manner of someone who has spent years delivering bad news while maintaining plausible neutrality about it. Mara had read that letter twice and filed it in the desk drawer and thought about it every day since. The second letter had arrived on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of November. It was shorter than the first. It noted that the next installment was due in 9 weeks and asked, in the measured language of institutional concern, whether she anticipated any difficulty meeting that obligation. It was signed by Gerald Fitch and included his office hours. She read it at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. Then she folded it carefully, put it in the same drawer as the first, and went out to move the sows to the upper pasture. 9 weeks. The sows needed at minimum another 6 to 8 weeks of conditioning before any of them would be ready for curing. Then the curing itself, 3 to 4 weeks, for a proper dry cure on the cuts her father's notebook described. Then smoking, which at the temperatures she was now achieving, would take the better part of a week for each batch. The math produced a result that she looked at from several angles, hoping one of the angles would make it work differently. None of them did. She had one realistic shot at getting finished product to any kind of buyer before that note came due, and it required everything to go right: the conditioning, the curing, the smoke, with no wasted batches, no sick animals, no equipment failures, and no problems she hadn't anticipated, which was the category that historically contained the most expensive surprises. That night, she wrote a letter to Gerald Fitch. She explained that she was developing a specialty smoked pork operation, that the animals were in conditioning, and that she expected to have product available for sale by mid-January. She did not use language like "I hope" or "I believe." She stated it as schedule. She asked him to note in the file that she would have the installment in full by the 1st week of February. She sealed the letter before she could revise it into something more cautious. In the morning, she mailed it from town. Nell Arden came by on a Wednesday with her daughter Josie, who was 16, and carried herself with the particular self-consciousness of a girl who has recently discovered that the world has opinions about her and hasn't yet decided how much weight to give them. Josie had her mother's narrow face and dark hair, and a habit of watching things carefully without appearing to a quality Mara recognized, because she'd developed the same habit herself at roughly the same age, for some of the same reasons. Nell had brought bread. She always brought something. Mara had begun to understand that this was not charity exactly, but a form of language Nell's way of saying she was present without making it awkward for either of them. They sat in the kitchen while Josie wandered out to the pens to look at the sows, which she'd asked about twice during the drive up and clearly found more interesting than she wanted to admit. The letter to the bank, Nell said. She didn't ask how she knew. In Red Creek, information moved through certain channels the way water moves through cracks, finding every available path. It's handled, Mara said. Is it? It will be. Nell looked at her with the expression she reserved for moments when she thought Mara was being precise about language in a way that avoided the actual question. That's two different things. I know what it is. Mara cut 2 slices from the bread. I'm not going to lose the farm, Nell. I didn't say you were going to lose it. I said people are talking. People have been talking since August. I've noticed it doesn't affect the hogs. Nell almost smiled. Almost. Harlan Creed told my neighbor's husband that he gives you until spring. Harlan Creed doesn't know what I'm building. Then maybe you should let someone know. Nell picked up her bread. Someone other than me, I mean. Someone who could actually. I'm not asking Harlan Creed for anything. The words came out flat and final, the way certain things do when they've been decided so deeply they've become geography rather than opinion. Nell held up one hand. I wasn't going to say Harlan Creed. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, they could hear Josie talking to the sows in the low, unself-conscious voice people use with animals when they think no one can hear them. She's good with them, Mara said. She's good with anything that doesn't talk back. Nell looked toward the window. She wants to study. Agriculture, she says now, though last month it was medicine. The month before that it was law. She paused. She's not going to get there on what I make taking in mending. Mara didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about something she hadn't fully articulated yet, even to herself an idea that had been forming at the edges of her planning, like frost forming at the edges of a window. Not a charity thought, a practical one. If this works, she said carefully, I'm going to need help. Real help, not just a neighbor borrowing a dog. Someone who can learn the operation. Nell was quiet. I can't pay much yet, but I can pay something. And there'd be meals. Josie has school, afternoons and Saturdays, and through winter break if she wants. Mara looked at her directly. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking because she's sharp and she'd be useful, and I'd rather teach someone who wants to learn than someone who already thinks they know. Nell took a long breath and let it out slowly. Let's see what January looks like, she said, which was not yes, but it was also not no. And from Nell Arden, it was close to the same thing. The cold that settled in during the first week of December was the serious kind, the kind that doesn't break for days, that turns the creek crossing into a negotiation with ice every morning and makes the first hour of outdoor work a study in what your body actually objects to versus what it can be persuaded past. Most of its windows were dark. Mara had insulated the sow pens in October, packing the windward walls with straw bales and patching the gaps in the roof that she'd identified during a September rainstorm. It wasn't comfortable for the animals, but it was survivable, and survival was the thresh she was working with. She was losing the feeling in her right index finger by 9 every morning. She'd wrapped it twice after banging it on a frozen latch in November, and it had healed imperfectly, as injuries do when you don't stop working long enough to let them properly heal. It didn't affect her grip significantly, but it was a constant small reminder of the cumulative cost of what she was doing, the way a lot of small things had become reminders. The knee that was louder going downhill than up, the shoulder that clicked when she reached too far overhead, the fatigue that settled deeper each week and took longer to sleep off. She thought sometimes in the honest hours before dawn, when she was lighting the stove and waiting for the water to boil, about what it would mean to fail. Not the financial version of failing. She'd run those numbers enough times that they'd lost some of their power, but the other kind. Most of its windows were dark. The kind where you attempted something, that everyone told you was wrong, and it turned out they were right, and then you had to figure out what to do with yourself in the aftermath of that. She didn't stay in those thoughts long. They weren't useful. What was useful was the 5th test burn, which she ran on a Thursday in the 2nd week of December, with the temperature outside at 19 degrees. The cold affected the chamber behavior differently than she'd expected the stone shed heat faster, which meant she needed more fuel to maintain temperature, and had to adjust her feed schedule by adding wood every 90 minutes instead of every 2 hours. She wrote this down. She recalculated her wood supply. She ordered another half cord from a man named Tad Briggs, who cut timber on the North Ridge and delivered it by wagon for $2, which she paid with money she'd been keeping separate specifically for firewood, because she'd known this moment was coming. The sows were ready. Not all of them. Some of the animals had responded to the forage and the conditioning better than others, which was itself information, something to understand rather than just manage. But a group of 12 had developed the kind of body condition her father's notebook described, deep through the shoulder, settled in their movement, with the particular density that comes from slow growth on varied feed rather than the soft, uniform weight of grain-fed animals pushed to market weight on a production schedule. She selected 8. The selection process took 2 days. She went through the herd methodically, running her hands along backs and shoulders, checking the depth of cover, watching how each animal moved. She made marks in her notebook next to the animals that met her criteria and crossed out the ones that didn't. A few of the crossed-out animals she was close, on animals that were good but not right, that needed more time rather than a different fate. She put those in a separate mental category and let them continue. The 8 she chose went into the holding pen on a Friday evening. She slaughtered them herself. This is a thing that is difficult to write around without dishonesty, so it should be stated plainly. Mara Voss, alone on a December morning with the temperature at 16 degrees, did the work that needed doing. She had grown up on a farm. She understood that the distance between a live animal and a cured ham is not a comfortable distance, and that people who pretend otherwise are engaged in a particular kind of pretending that she had no patience for. It took her most of the day. She worked carefully, which is the only way to work when you're working alone, and there is no margin for an error that requires 2 people to correct. By the time the light was going, she had the carcasses hanging in the slaughter shed. The temperature outside cold enough to serve as its own refrigeration, and she had 8 animals' worth of work ahead of her. She went inside and ate. She was very tired. She went back out after an hour, because there were things that couldn't wait. The next morning, she began breaking down the carcasses into the cuts. Her father's notebook specified the long cured hams that would be the centerpiece of the operation, the shoulders for a different cure, the belly cuts that she was less certain about and had marked as experimental in her notebook. She worked at the table in the stone outbuilding she'd converted to a cutting room in October, her hands red from cold. Despite the gloves, her breath coming in clouds. This was where Josie appeared, unannounced, at 8 in the morning, with a note from Nell saying she had the day free from school because of a broken stove in the schoolhouse. Josie stood in the doorway of the cutting room, looking at what Mara was doing with the particular of a 16-year-old who has not quite decided whether to step forward or back. "Your mother sends you?" Mara asked without looking up from her work. "She said you might need help. Do you know how to do this?" A pause. "No. Are you willing to learn?" Another pause, slightly shorter. "Yes." Mara put down her knife, wiped her hands, and walked Josie through the first cut step by step. Josie asked 3 questions in the first 10 minutes, all of them practical and none of them stupid, which told Mara what she'd suspected since the Wednesday when she'd watched Josie talk to the sows without knowing she was being observed. By noon, Josie was working the shoulder cuts without direction. By 2 in the afternoon, when the light was starting to fail and the cold was pushing through the stone walls, despite the small stove in the corner, they had the cuts they needed, laid out and sorted and ready for curing. "Same time tomorrow?" Josie asked, pulling on her coat. "If your mother agrees." "She'll agree." Josie buttoned her coat. It was too thin for the weather, Mara noticed. The kind of coat that worked in October but not December. "Miss Voss?" "Mara." "Mara," she tried it out. "Do you think it's going to work?" Mara looked at the cuts laid out on the table. All that careful selection, all those months of conditioning, all those test burns and failed batches and adjusted vents distilled down to this, the raw material waiting for the process that would prove or disprove everything. I think the animals are right, she said. I think the feed was right. I think the smokehouse is right. She paused. Whether it all adds up to something, that's what January's for. Josie seemed to consider this as an answer and find it acceptable, which made Mara think better of her than she already did. Then she was gone, and Mara was alone in the cutting room with what she'd built toward for 4 months, and the evening coming in fast over the oak ridge. The curing mixture she'd developed over 3 iterations was her own modification of her father's original sea salt, brown sugar, cracked black pepper, rubbed sage, and the things she'd added herself, dried wild juniper berries, crushed fine, worked into the salt mixture in a ratio she'd arrived at through trial and argument with herself over whether it was too much, too little, too unusual. Her father's notebook had mentioned juniper once, briefly, as a possibility he'd never fully explored. Mara had explored it through 2 small test batches on pork shoulders in November, and what she'd found in the finished meat, a low resinous note underneath the smoke, something that made the flavor finish differently than plain cured pork, had been enough to make it permanent. She applied the cure to the hams herself, working each one individually, pressing the mixture into every surface, with hands that had enough memory of the work now to feel what was too thin and what was too heavy. She recorded the weight of each ham, the amount of cure applied, the date. She hung the temperature gauge she'd bought secondhand from a traveling supplies merchant and checked it 3 times a day. The hams went into the stone curing room, the back section of the smokehouse she'd converted for the purpose, separate from the smoke chamber, with a vent that allowed cold air circulation without drafts. She'd packed the floor with clean sawdust to manage moisture. Windows were dark. The temperature had to stay between 34 and 38 degrees for the first 2 weeks, which in December on a north-facing hillside was achievable without active effort, which was the only reason December was actually the right month for this step. She checked them every morning. The first week passed without incident, which she didn't trust. The second week, she found a problem. 2 of the 8 hams were curing unevenly, the thick end developing too fast relative to the shank end, which meant the salt was drawing moisture at different rates through the muscle. She'd seen this in her failed November batches, and had thought she'd corrected for it by adjusting the initial cut depth. She'd been wrong. She stood in the curing room, looking at the 2 hams for a long time. Pulling them would mean wasting 6 weeks of conditioning, 2 animals' worth of work, and 2 of her 8 shots at a product she needed to be right. Leaving them meant she might end up with finished meat that was overcured in one section and undercured in another, which was not a problem you could smoke your way past. She pulled them. Then she stood outside the smokehouse in the December cold and breathed through the specific feeling of making a decision that was clearly correct and cost you something anyway. She went back inside and reapplied fresh cure to the salvageable portions, reducing them to 2 shoulder cuts rather than whole hams, and put them back in the curing room in the experimental column of her notebook. They might still produce something useful. They might not. But she had 6 hams that were curing correctly, and those 6 were what the next month was built on. 6. She'd started with 8. Christmas came and went with the particular quietness of a holiday spent mostly working. Nell brought Josie up on Christmas morning with a covered pan of sweet rolls, and the 3 of them sat in Mara's kitchen for an hour in the warmth, while the cold pressed against the windows. Josie had been coming 4 afternoons a week since the day the schoolhouse stove broke, learning the curing room routine, learning to read the temperature gauge, learning the smell of the cure at different stages, the sharp salt smell of the first days, shifting gradually into something deeper and more complex as the weeks passed. She was a quick study. More importantly, she was honest about what she didn't know, which was rarer than quickness. "I told Mama this is what I want to do," Josie said at some point during that Christmas morning. She'd been looking out the window toward the smokes, half her attention on the conversation, and half somewhere else. "This specifically?" Mara asked. "Not specifically." But she gestured vaguely. "Farming. That's not the right word. The science of it. Why things work. Why the juniper does what it does to the fat. Why the acorn feed changes the marbling. All of that." She turned back from the window. "Is there a school for that?" "Agricultural colleges," Mara said. Several of them. Good ones. That costs money. Yes. A lot of it, yes. Mara looked at her directly. But not infinite money and not all at once. She paused. Some things are worth doing slowly. Josie looked at her with an expression that was working toward something, some understanding she was arriving at from her own direction, rather than being pointed toward. Then she picked up her sweet roll and went back to looking out the window. Nell caught Mara's eye across the table and held it for a moment. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The first week of January, Mara fired the smokehouse. The 6 cured hams had been hanging in the curing room for 22 days, which was 2 days short of her target, but within the range her father's notebook considered acceptable for hams of this size and cut. She'd made the decision to move them to smoke on a Thursday evening, after spending an hour in the curing room, each one checking the firmness, reading the color of the cure through the exterior. They were ready. She was certain enough of it to commit. She had calculated her wood with the obsessive precision of someone who understands that every variable she can control is a variable she must control, because the ones she can't control are already long enough. She'd built her smoke mix from 3/4 seasoned hickory to 1/4 dried apple wood, with a small addition of juniper twigs, thin ones, for fragrance rather than heat that she added in the first hour and not after. The chamber was at temperature by 5 in the morning, the hanging space filled with the slow, even smoke she'd spent months learning to produce. She did not sleep that night. She checked the temperature every 90 minutes. She adjusted the north vent at 2 in the morning when the outside temperature dropped and the chamber started running cool. She added wood at 4:30. She watched the color of the smoke coming from the upper flues, the pale blue that meant correct temperature, the white that meant too cool, the dark gray that meant too hot, and she managed it the way a person manages something they've learned to read in their body as much as their mind. By the 3rd day, the smokehouse smelled like nothing Mara had ever smelled in that building or anywhere else. It was not just smoked meat she knew that smell, had grown up with it. This was different, deeper. There was something underneath the smoke that she associated with the oak forest on a damp morning. Something that the juniper and the apple wood were adding to the hickory base. Something that made the interior of the smokehouse smell like a place where serious things were happening. On the 5th day, Josie arrives at 6 in the morning without being asked. She stood at the smokehouse door and breathed it in, and then she looked at Mara with an expression that required no translation. "Is that what it's supposed to smell like?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Mara said honestly. "I've never done this right before. I only know what wrong smells like." Josie nodded. She went to get the temperature log and began recording the morning readings. On the 7th day, Mara opened the smokehouse and took down the first ham. It was the largest of the 6, the one she'd been watching most carefully, because size meant the longest time to cure and the most risk of inconsistency. The exterior was dark, a deep mahogany color that the smoke and the cure and the fat rendered had produced together over 7 days. The surface was firm under her hands. The smell of it was precise and complex in a way that she had no good language for yet, because she'd never smelled this before and she was still building the vocabulary. She carried it to the cutting room. She sharpened her knife. Josie stood across the table and watched without speaking, which was the correct instinct. Mara cut into the ham. The interior was the right color, a deep, even rose from shank to center, without the gray patches that had marked her failed batches, without the uneven streaks that meant inconsistent cure. The fat was creamy white in the places where it had rendered between the muscle, and when she cut a thin slice and held it up to the morning light coming through the cutting room window, she could see the marbling that all those months of acorn and apple forage had put into the meat-fine threads, the fat woven right through the muscle, in a way she recognized from her father's notebook, which had described it as the thing that made everything else worth attempting. She cut a piece. She was not a woman who performed emotion. She had been careful about that all her life, for reasons that anyone who has been laughed at for being large and female in a small town would understand without further explanation. She had taught herself to process things internally, to keep her face neutral, to give people as little to read as possible. But standing in the cutting room on a January morning with a knife in her hand and a piece of smoked ham that tasted like nothing she had words for, yet Mara Voss's face did what it was going to do, regardless of what she told it, which was to do nothing at first, pure blank stillness, and then to change in a way that Josie Arden would remember for the rest of her life and describe. 40 years later, to her own students, in terms that were remarkably precise for something that happened in a cold stone room in January. It's right, Mara said. Her voice was level. But her hands were not quite steady when she put the knife down. Let me try, Josie said. Mara cut her a piece. Josie ate it in 2 bites and stood there chewing with the expression of a person recalibrating. Then she swallowed and said, with the directness of someone who hasn't yet learned to soften assessments, "That's not like anything I've had before." No, Mara said, it's not. The remaining 5 hams hung in the smokehouse. The banknote was due in 3 weeks. The winter still had 2 months left in it. The Oak Ridge was white with frost, and the road down to Red Creek was frozen hard enough to ring when a horse hoof struck it. But in the cutting room, on the table between them, the slice of ham was exactly what 6 months of debt and ridicule and failed batches and frozen mornings and 2 broken chisels and 1 sick sow and a collection of handwritten notes from a dead man had been working toward. Mara wrapped the ham in clean cloth. She put it in the cold box. She wrote the date and the batch number on the label in her careful, precise handwriting. Then she went back to the smokehouse to check the temperature on the remaining 5. Because was not the same as finished, and she had learned by now that every step forward was also the beginning of the next problem. But she allowed herself, walking through the frozen farmyard, with her breath coming in white clouds and the blue smoke rising straight, and even from the smokehouse chimney above her, to feel the particular satisfaction of a person who has built something difficult and found that it holds. She allowed herself that, and then she got back to work. The remaining 5 hams came out of the smokehouse over the next 2 days, and each one confirmed what the first had told her. Not in a triumphant way, not in the way that stories sometimes describe discovery, that clean, cinematic moment where everything resolves into certainty. It was more complicated than that, because Mara was too careful a person to mistake 5 successful hams for a proven operation. 5 hams was a proof of concept. What she needed was a buyer, and a buyer meant someone outside the cutting room and the farmyard and the small world of people who already believed in her, or at least had stopped actively disbelieving. She wrapped all 6 hams in clean cloth, labeled each one with the batch number and date, and put 5 of them in the cold box. The 6th she set aside. She'd been thinking about Tobias Rusk for 2 weeks. Tobias ran a freight route that connected Red Creek to 4 other towns in the county, covering roughly 80 miles of road in a 3-day circuit that he'd been doing since he was 22 and was now doing at 38 with the efficiency of someone who has reduced a complex job to its essential shens. He stopped at Mara's farm occasionally because the road to the upper properties ran past her gate, and twice in the fall he'd bought eggs from her when she had surplus. He was a spare, quiet man who didn't say much, but he had the particular quality of someone who notices without making a production of noticing them. More importantly, Tobias Rusk made stops at the Alderman Hotel in Caldwell, which was the largest town on his route. The Alderman had a dining room that was considered the best restaurant within 40 miles, and its kitchen was run by a man named Caleb Wren, who had a reputation for quality that extended well beyond Caldwell and who was, by every account Mara had been able to gather through careful conversation, a man who knew food and took it seriously. She needed Tobias to carry the ham to Caleb Wren. She needed Caleb Wren to taste it, and she needed both of those things to happen before the banknote came due, which was now 19 days away. She wrapped the 6th ham in a second layer of cloth, then in burlap, and tied it with cord. She wrote a note on a piece of paper, not a letter. Exactly. More like a statement of facts, what the animals had been fed, how long the cure had taken, what wood she'd used in the smoke, the juniper edition, the weight of the finished ham. She folded the note and tucked it under the cord. Then she walked down the frozen road to the junction where Tobias made his Tuesday stop. He was 20 minutes late, which gave her time to reconsider the whole plan twice and arrive back at the same conclusion both times. When the wagon appeared around the bend, moving at the steady pace of a man who was never in a hurry because he was never behind schedule, she stepped out from the gate where she'd been waiting. Tobias pulled the horses up and looked at her, then at the bundled ham under her arm. He didn't say anything, which was typical. I need a favor, Mara said. She decided to say it plainly. Not a charity favor. A business one, all right. You make a stop at the Alderman, Tuesday and Friday. I need you to take this to Caleb Wren. She held up the ham. Tell him it's from Mara Voss at the hill farm north of Red Creek. Tell him what it is. If he wants to talk terms, he can send word with you on Friday. Tobias looked at the bundle for a long moment. He had the kind of face that was hard to read not because he was hiding things, but because he simply didn't put his thinking on the outside. You want me to just hand Caleb Wren a ham? Yes. He's a particular man. About his kitchen. I know Mara kept her eyes on him. That's why I want him to have it. Another pause. Tobias scratched the side of his jaw. What if he doesn't want it? Then I'll know that too. She said it without flinching, which cost her something because the alternative to Caleb Wren wanting it was a problem she hadn't fully solved yet. Will you take it? He considered for what felt like a long time but was probably 10 seconds. Then he reached down for the bundle. I'll take it. I appreciate it. Don't thank me yet. He set the ham carefully behind the seat, with the particular care of someone who has transported enough cargo to know what needs protecting. He might just use it for soup stock. He won't, Mara said. Tobias looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it didn't quite get there. Then he clicked to the horses and moved on down the road, and Mara stood at the junction watching the wagon go until it rounded the bend and disappeared. She had 19 days. The wait was the hardest thing she'd done since the whole winter started, and the winter had contained things that were objectively harder. She knew this about herself, that waiting was worse than working, that the absence of something to do with her hands allowed her mind to run calculations she didn't want to run. She addressed this the way she addressed most internal problems, by finding more work. She spent the 3 days between Tuesday and Friday preparing the remaining hams for a second curing cycle. She'd already selected the next group of animals this time, having adjusted her selection criteria based on what the first batch had taught her, and she began the process of breaking them down with Josie's help, the two of them working in the cutting room, with the small stove running and their breath still fogging in the corners where the heat didn't quite reach. Josie had developed, in the 6 weeks since the broken schoolhouse stove had first brought her to the farm, a kind of competence that was notable because she'd built it from nothing through the specific mechanism of paying attention and asking questions without embarrassment. She'd asked Sows once, while they were working the cure into a shoulder cut, why the juniper worked the way it did, what it was actually doing to the fat chemically, not just what it tasted like. Mara had said she didn't know exactly, that she understood it empirically but not scientifically, and that finding out why would require either a chemist or an agricultural college with the right faculty. Josie had written this down in a small notebook she'd started keeping, which Mara had noticed and said nothing about, because some things are better not commented on directly. On Wednesday evening, Nell came by without Josie and sat at the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "People know you sent something to the alderman." Mara looked up from the notebook she was writing in. How Tobias talks to people. Not about your business specifically, but he mentioned the stop, and people know what that kitchen is. Nell wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. There's betting at the feed store about whether Caleb Wren sends back an order or sends back the ham. What are the odds? Nell hesitated, which was its own answer. Say it, Nell. 4 to 1 he sends it back. She looked uncomfortable. Harlan Creed put money on it. He told Dob Purvis that Caleb Wren's kitchen doesn't take charity product from hill farms. Mara absorbed this. She kept her face where she'd learned to keep it. How much did Creed put in? $10. That's a lot of money to spend on being right about someone else's failure. That's Harlan. Nell watched her carefully. Are you all right? I'm fine. Mara went back to her notebook. Then she stopped and looked up. What are the odds on my side? Nell almost smiled despite herself. Nobody's bet on your side yet. Because they don't want to waste the money, or because they don't want to be seen doing it. Nell considered this seriously, which was one of the things Mara valued about her. Both, probably. Mara nodded once. She picked up her pen. Friday, she said. Which was all she said, and Nell understood it to mean the conversation was finished, at least on that topic. Friday came with freezing rain that turned the road into something that required careful negotiation and coated every surface with a thin layer of ice that caught the morning light and made the whole world look sharp and temporary. Mara was in the cutting room when she heard the wagon, which was 2 hours later than Tobias's usual Friday time, attributable to the road conditions. She came to the gate. Tobias climbed down from the wagon with the deliberate care of a man working with icy footing. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He wrote it himself, Tobias said. Caleb Wren. Sat down right at the kitchen table and wrote it while I waited. Mara took the paper. She didn't open it immediately. His cook tasted it first, Tobias continued, with the manner of someone who has been holding information since Tuesday and is now releasing it in the order it occurred. Then Wren came out of the back and tasted it. Then he sent his cook out of the kitchen and tasted it again alone. Tobias paused. He didn't say much, just sat down and wrote that. Mara opened the paper. The handwriting was precise and businesslike. Caleb Wren wrote that he had tasted the smoked ham from the hill farm and found it unlike any product currently available to his kitchen. He was prepared to discuss a standing order. He was asking for pricing on whole hams and bone-in shoulders, and whether the supply could be consistent. He needed a response by the following Friday. He signed his name without ornamentation. Mara read it twice. She folded it the same way she'd folded the bank's second letter carefully, with attention to the crease, the way you fold something you're going to keep. He asked about you, Tobias said. What kind of operation? How many animals? I told him what I knew, which wasn't much. What did he say to that? He said. Tobias paused, working to get it right. He said whoever taught you the smoke. They taught you something worth knowing. Mara looked at the folded letter in her hands. Nobody taught me, she said. My father left notes. Tobias nodded slowly. I'll be going back through Tuesday, he said, if you've got a reply. I'll have a reply Monday, Mara said. Can you take it Sunday evening? I'll come to the junction. Sunday evening is fine. She thanked him. He climbed back up onto the wagon with the same careful deliberateness and moved off down the road. Mara stood at the gate in the freezing rain with the letter in her coat pocket and the farm behind her and the oak ridge above her white with ice and entirely still. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and worked out her pricing. She worked on the pricing for 3 hours, which was 2 hours longer than the actual arithmetic required. Because what she was really doing was something harder than arithmetic. She was deciding what the product was worth, which required deciding what she was worth, which was a calculation that nobody in Red Creek had ever invited her to make on her own terms before. She set the price 20% higher than she'd initially planned. Then she looked at that number for a long time. She thought about Harlan Creed's $10 at the feed store and the 4-to-1 odds and the fat farm girl on her hog picnic and every other piece of commentary that had accumulated over the past 6 months like sediment at the bottom of a still pond. She thought about her father's notebook and the 20 years he'd spent on an idea he never got to finish. She thought about the banknote in the drawer and the 15-week-old debt it represented, and the letter she'd sent to Gerald Fitch with its confident, unhedged language about February. She set the price 30% higher than she's initially planned. Then she wrote the reply to Caleb Wren. It was a short letter. She told him the price per whole ham, the price per bone-in shoulder, the available quantity for the current season, and the schedule she could commit to 1 delivery per month through March, contingent on maintaining herd condition, with the possibility of expansion in the fall if they reached an agreement on volume. She told him the juniper was her own addition and would remain consistent. She told him the animals were forage raised on this specific hillside and that the product was not and would not be interchangeable with commercial smoked pork. She didn't apologize for the price. She didn't hedge it. She stated it as fact. The way you state the weight of a ham or the temperature of a smoke chamber, this is the number. And the number reflects the thing you tasted. She sealed the letter Sunday morning and walked to the junction in the dark before Tobias was due, because she'd been awake since 4 and staying inside was no longer useful. The reply from Caleb Wren came on Tuesday, again written in that precise hand. He accepted the price without negotiation, which surprised her enough that she read the letter 3 times, looking for a qualification she'd missed. There wasn't one. He agreed to the schedule. He asked for a first delivery the following Friday and requested, if possible, that she send the product with a brief written description of the feeding and curing process. His guests, he wrote, were beginning to ask questions about the kitchen suppliers, and he preferred to answer with specifics rather than generalities. She sat with that sentence for a moment. His guests were asking questions. She went to find Josie. Josie was in the curing room, doing her afternoon check on the second batch. She'd developed the habit of talking quietly to herself while she worked, not exactly narrating, more like she was thinking out loud in a voice just below the threshold of being intended for an audience. Mara had never mentioned it. First order, Mara said from the doorway. 4 hams, 2 shoulders. Delivery Friday. Josie turned around. She had the temperature log in one hand and a pencil behind her ear and a small smear of Curse mixture on her left wrist, where she'd been checking the application. Caleb Wren? Caleb Wren. Josie's expression did something that she hadn't yet learned to control as well as she thought she had. At his price? At my price. Josie stood very still for a moment. Then she said, with the understatement of someone learning to manage her own reactions, "That's good." "That's the beginning," Mara said. "We need to talk about what comes after." What came after was the part Mara had been building toward. In the part of her mind she kept separate from the daily crisis management, the longer calculation, the one that looked past the first order and the banknote and asked what a functioning version of this operation actually looked like. She'd been making notes on it for weeks, on a separate page at the back of the same notebook, in smaller handwriting than her usual, as though she was trying not to take up too much space with a plan she wasn't yet sure she could execute. The first delivery needed to be perfect. Not because one order made or broke the operation, but because Caleb Wren was the kind of buyer whose satisfaction translated into other buyers' hotel kitchens, talked to each other. Freight drivers like Tobias moved through a network of information as much as goods, and a successful delivery to the alderman would carry the farm's name further than any effort she could make herself. She packed the order Thursday evening, with Josie helping, and Nell sitting at the cutting room table, keeping the record book, which had become Nell's unofficial role, without anyone formally assigning it. Nell had a precision with figures that she'd never had occasion to use before, and that turned out to be genuinely valuable. She caught a pricing error in Mara's first draft of the Wren invoice and a miscalculation in the feed cost spreadsheet. That would have thrown off the February projections. "You have a head for this," Mara told her, not as a compliment exactly, but as an observation that carried the same weight. "I have a head for numbers," Nell said. "Always did. Roy never needed it, so it just sat there." Roy was her late husband. She said his name without particular effect, the way people refer to facts that have finished changing anything. "What are you going to pay me?" Mara looked at her. This was the conversation she'd been working toward since Christmas morning, and it was happening now because Nell had decided to have it on her own terms, which was typically how Nell did things. "What I can afford right now is not what I think this work is worth," Mara said carefully. "I know that." "Say a number anyway." Mara said a number. It was modest, and she knew it was modest, and she said so without dressing it up. Nell was quiet for a moment. "With meals." "With meals. And when it grows, the number grows with it. On paper. Not just a conversation." Nell looked at her steadily. "On paper," she repeated. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the record book, which Mara understood to be agreement on terms. The Friday delivery went without incident, which felt less like success and more like the absence of the disaster she'd been braced for since Tuesday. Tobias loaded the order at the farm gate in the early morning cold, wrapped in Mara's layered cloth and burlap system, packed in a wooden crate she'd built specifically for this purpose, from boards she'd salvaged from the collapsed corner of one of the outbuildings. The crate had a fitted lid and rope handles, and was not beautiful but was sturdy and kept the product at temperature for the 6-hour journey to Caldwell. She didn't hear back until the following Tuesday. In the intervening days, she restocked firewood, checked the second curing batch, moved 3 of the slower conditioning sows to a different section of the hillside where the remaining forage was better, repaired a section of fence that a branch had damaged in the ice storm, and did not sleep particularly well on any of the 4 nights. She was not a person who could tell herself not to think about something and then successfully not think about it. What she could do was keep moving, which amounted to roughly the same result. Tuesday morning, Tobias appeared at the junction an hour earlier than usual. He handed her a letter and a small parcel she didn't immediately understand. The letter was from Caleb Wren. The parcel turned out to be payment cash, in the full amount of her invoice, which was not how she'd expected it, since she'd proposed net 30 days. Attached to the payment was a note in Wren's handwriting that said simply, "Advance on standing order. When can you deliver next?" She looked at the money. She looked at the note. He had 3 dinner parties this week, Tobias said. All of them asked about the ham. 2 of them asked specifically where they could buy it. Mara folded the payment into her coat pocket. Her hands were completely steady, which surprised her slightly. Tobias paused. He talked to someone at the Continental up in Harmon City. That's a bigger hotel than the Alderman. I don't know what he said, but Tobias. He stopped. One thing at a time, she said. He nodded. He seemed to understand what she meant, which was not that she wasn't interested in the Continental in Harmon City, but that she needed to not be interested in it yet, because wanting too much too fast was how people made the kind of mistakes that unraveled careful work. She took the cash to Gerald Fitch's office the next morning. Gerald Fitch was a man of approximately 50 who had the quality of someone who has sat behind the same desk for so long that the desk has become an extension of himself. He seemed incomplete standing up. He had a careful, measured way of speaking that Mara had initially read as coldness and had gradually revised to something more like the professional habit of a man who has learned that words in his position carry financial weight and should be spent accordingly. He looked at the cash she placed on his desk. He looked at her. He looked back at the cash. "This is the full installment," he said, "plus next quarter's in advance." Mara sat in the chair across from him with her coat still buttoned. "I'd like to discuss the remaining debt schedule." Fitch was quiet for a moment, and in that moment his face did something small, not surprise exactly, because a banker trained surprise out of his expressions early in his career, but something adjacent to it. A recalibration. "Of course," he said. He opened the file. "Miss Voss, I have to say." "Mr. Fitch." He stopped. "I sent you a letter in November stating I would have the installment in February." She kept her voice even. "I have it in January. I'd like to talk about the schedule going forward, not about whether this outcome was expected." Another pause. Longer. Then Fitch said, "Of course." He pulled out the payment schedule and laid it between them. "What are you proposing?" They talked for 40 minutes. When Mara left, the debt was restructured on terms that reflected an operation with demonstrated income rather than an operation running on hope and a theory. Fitch had not been generous exactly. He was a banker, and he remained a banker, but he had been fair, which was all she'd asked for and more than she'd been certain of getting. She stood on the wooden sidewalk outside his office in the January cold and looked down the main street of Red Creek, which was mostly empty at mid-morning on a Wednesday, a few horses at the rail outside the feed store, smoke coming from the chimneys of the businesses that were open, an ordinary midweek morning in a small county town. She thought about standing at the auction gate in September, with her receipt folded in her pocket. She thought about Harlan Creed's voice, carrying across the yard. She thought about Nell at the kitchen table and Josie in the curing room with the temperature log in her hand and her father's notebook in the drawer with the careful, unfinished handwriting, covering page after page of an idea nobody had believed in except the man who wrote it down and the daughter who found it. She didn't stand there long. She had work to get back to. The word spread through Red Creek, the way things spread in small places, not through any single announcement, but through accumulation. Tobias mentioned the Alderman order to someone. Someone mentioned it to someone else. The feed store betting came to its conclusion, and the men who'd put money on 4-to-1 odds had to settle up, which Mara heard about from Nell with a specificity that suggested Nell had not been entirely displeased by the reporting. Harlan Creed heard about it on a Thursday. She knew this because he came to the farm on a Friday morning, which was not something she'd expect, and she processed with the particular alertness of someone who has learned to read the timing of visits as carefully as the visits themselves. He came alone without the 2 ranch hands who usually accompanied him on business calls, which was itself a kind of communication. She was in the cutting room when she heard the horse, and she came out with her hands unwrapped from the work gloves and her coat half buttoned against the cold, which meant she was meeting him on her own ground in the middle of her own workday rather than cleaned up and prepared, and she did not apologize for this or change anything about it. Harlan Creed looked different from the way he'd looked at the auction. Not smaller exactly, he was still a large, solidly built man with the rancher's confidence that came from owning more of the county than most people. But something in his bearing had shifted in a way that Mara couldn't quite name yet, some adjustment in how he was holding himself. He looked at the smokehouse. He looked at the cutting room she'd come out of. He looked at the herd visible on the lower hillside. He took it in with the assessment of a man who has spent 40 years reading the condition of livestock and land and doesn't stop doing it even when that's not why he's there. "Miss Voss," he said, "Mr. Creed." She waited. She had learned a long time ago that waiting was a form of power that was available to everyone, regardless of size or gender, or the amount of money they'd bet at the feed store. He was quiet for a moment. He had his hat in his hands, which she noticed. "I heard about the alderman all right. And the bank." He paused. "The note." She didn't say anything. "I made a statement at the auction," Harlan said. "In September." He stopped again, and in the stopping she could see what this was costing him, which was the specific coin that men like Harlan Creed paid rarely and spent carefully. "I was wrong." The wind moved across the farmyard. Somewhere in the upper pasture, one of the sows made a sound that carried across the cold air. The smokehouse chimney was putting up its thin blue line against the gray January sky. "I know you were," Mara said. "Not cruelty, just fact." Harlan nodded once. He seemed to have expected this and to have made his peace with it before he came, which elevated him slightly in her estimation. "I've got 11 sows I was planning to sell off in the spring. All past prime. Strong animals, good lines, just not what the feedlots want." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I heard you're buying that kind." Mara looked at him steadily. "What are you asking for them?" He named a price. It was a fair price, not cheap, but fair, the price of a man who was not trying to take advantage and also not trying to punish himself with generosity. It was a business price, offered by one person to another. Mara thought about it for longer than she needed to, not because she was uncertain, but because she was deciding how to close this conversation in a way that didn't humiliate him and also didn't let him off so easily that the weight of the auction yard was forgotten entirely. "I'll take them," she said. "Delivery when the road's passable. And I'll need the feed history. I'll write it up." "Good." She put her gloves back on. "Come in January. I'll have Nell make coffee." He blinked at that, at the normalcy of it, the total absence of theater. Then he put his hat back on. "January," he said. "Midweek is better. We're doing deliveries Fridays." He almost said something else. She could see it in the way his mouth shaped itself for a different sentence. Then he let it go and turned his horse and rode back down the frozen road toward town, and Mara watched him go with her hands in her gloves and her mind already on the 11 new animals and what the hillside's carrying capacity was and how the second smoke batch was progressing, and whether Josie's notebook had the Tuesday temperature readings in it yet. She turned back to the cutting room. The cold had gotten into the stove while she was outside, and she spent 5 minutes rebuilding the fire before she could get back to work. The wood caught slowly, and then, all at once, which was usually how things worked, and she held her hands over the growing heat until the feeling came back into her fingers. Then she picked up her knife and went back to what she'd been doing. Outside, the blue smoke continued its steady rise from the smokehouse chimney. Visible from the road, all the way to the junction, a thin signal against the winter sky that said, to anyone who knew how to read it, that something was happening up on the hill farm that hadn't been happening before, that the work was ongoing, that the fire was tended, that someone up there wasn't stopping. Harlan Creed came on a Wednesday in the third week of January, as promised, with his feed records written up in a hand that was unexpectedly neat for a man of his type, careful columns, dates, quantities, the kind of documentation that suggested he took his animals seriously, even when he was selling them off as surplus. He sat at Mara's kitchen table and drank Nell's coffee, and went through the records with Mara, page by page, answering her questions without defensiveness, which was a different version of Harlan Creed than the one who had performed for the auction yard in September. Nell moved around the kitchen with the particular economy of someone who is listening carefully while appearing to do something else entirely. Josie was in the curing room, which was where she spent most of her non-school hours now. She'd started its windows dark. She'd started keeping a second notebook of her own separate from the officials' writing questions, in which she was writing down questions she didn't yet have answers to. Morris had seen it once, briefly, when Josie had left it on the cutting room table. The questions were good ones, the kind that required either a laboratory or several more years of careful observation to answer. These three, Mara said, pointing to 3 entries in Harlan's feed record. They were on grain supplement through October, corn mostly. They were underweight coming out of summer. How long ago did you pull them off it? Harlan considered 8-9 weeks. Mara made a note. 9 weeks of grain supplement finishing was not ideal. It would have laid down a different quality of fat than the animals she'd been conditioning on forage since September. Not disqualifying, but it meant those 3 would need a longer conditioning period on the hillside before they were ready. She wrote this down. Harlan watched her write. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen there before, or hadn't been in a position to notice before, a kind of attention that was different from the calculating assessment he'd used at the auction. He was watching her think, and he seemed to find it interesting in a way he hadn't expected. How did you work out the feed ratios, he asked. It was a genuine question, not a challenge. For the conditioning. My father's notes mostly. And observation. She set the pen down. And a lot of batches that didn't come out right. How many batches? Enough. He accepted this. He drank his coffee. Your father was, he paused, choosing the word. He was considered an unusual man. He was considered impractical, Mara said. There's a difference. Harlan looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. I suppose there is. The money changed hands before he left a deposit on the 11 Sows, with the remainder due on delivery. Mara wrote out the terms on paper, 2 copies, and they both signed. It was the first time she'd conducted a formal purchase agreement rather than a handshake arrangement, and the formality of it felt correct, not because she didn't trust Harlan specifically, but because its windows were dark, but because she was building something that needed to run on paper rather than on social arrangements that depended on who was currently in whose good standing. Harlan folded his copy, put it in his coat, and stood up. He picked up his hat. He did not say anything sentimental, which she was grateful for, because sentiment from Harlan Creed would have required her to find somewhere to put it, and she didn't currently have the space. Good operation, he said. That was all. Then he left. Nell came to stand in the kitchen doorway and watched his horse go down the road. Well, she said. Well, Mara agreed. She looked at the signed paper in her hand. 11 more animals. Longer conditioning requirement on 3 of them. New calculations for hillside capacity. Feed supplementation. Timing against the next smoke batch. She was already running the numbers in her head before she'd put the contract in the desk drawer. You didn't gloat, Nell said. No. Most people would have. Most people aren't trying to buy his sows. Nell looked at her for a moment with the expression she sometimes wore when she was deciding whether to say the thing she was thinking. She decided against it, which was probably wise, and went back to the record book instead. February arrived, and the operation had reached the particular state that Mara recognized from her father's descriptions of good farming. Not easy, not comfortable, but functional. A working rhythm that held its shape even when individual days were difficult. The second smoke batch had gone through the chamber in the last week of January. 6 hams and 4 shoulders, all of them successful, which meant she now had the beginning of what she was starting to think of not as a lucky run, but as a repeatable process. Caleb Wren had sent 3 letters in January alone. The third one mentioned the Continental Hotel in Harmon City, which meant Tobias had been right and the information had moved. The way information moved in the freight network, not through any deliberate promotion on Mara's part, but through the natural mechanism of a kitchen, producing food that caused people to ask questions. She had not responded to the Continental mention. Not yet. She mentioned it to Josie on a Thursday afternoon while they were working in the curing room, applying the salt cure to the first of Harlan Creed's conditioned animals, 4 of the 8 that had been on the hillside, long enough to meet her criteria, the grain-supplemented 3, still running several weeks behind. The Continental is 3 times the Alderman, Josie said. She had looked it up, which Mara had suspected she would. More guests. Better wine cellar, supposedly. The kind of place where people come from other states. I know what the Continental is. Are you going to respond? Mara ran her hands along the surface of the cure, checking for evenness. I'm thinking about it. What's to think about? It's a bigger order. A bigger order requires more product. More product requires more animals. More animals requires more hillside capacity, more curing space, more smokehouse time. She moved to the next cut. The hillsides has a limit. I've been mapping it since October. I can run maybe 60 animals on this property without degrading the forage quality, and I'm already at 56, with Harlan's 11 coming in. Josie was quiet, working the cure into the shoulder cut in front of her with the careful attention she brought to everything she'd learned here. So you'd need more land, or a different arrangement, or both. Mara looked at her. Or I say no to the Continental, which is also an option. Josie's expression said clearly what she thought of that option. There's a difference, Mara said, between turning down a good offer and letting a good offer turn you into something you don't want to be. She finished the cut she was working on and made her mark in the record. I've seen men chase the next contract until the thing that made them worth contracting with was gone. Your father, she stopped. Josie looked up. I'm sorry, Mara said. I shouldn't have. No, go ahead. Mara met her eyes. Roy chased the mill contract to Harmon City. Bigger work, better pay. And then the mill changed its supplier, and he was 3 counties from home with a family and no fallback. She said it carefully, without editorializing. That's not about your father being wrong. That's about scale outrunning foundation. Josie was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had picked up and was working at the edges of the smokehouse door in the way it did on February afternoons, finding every gap that needed attention. He wasn't wrong, she finally said. He just went too fast. Most people do. Josie went back to her work. Then, without looking up, so what do you do about the Continental? I find out what they actually need. Not what sounds impressive, what they specifically need, and whether it matches what I can actually deliver on the timeline I can deliver it. Mara picked up her pen and made the batch notation. Then I decide. She wrote to the Continental's purchasing manager, a man named August Schell, on a Saturday morning while Nell worked the ledger at the other end of the table. The letter was precise and brief. She described the operation and its current capacity. She stated what she could commit to on a standing monthly basis without compromising quality. She named the price, which was the same price she'd given Caleb Wren, with a small addition for the greater distance. She said Shivit's windows were dark. She said she was interested in discussing a relationship if they could work within those parameters, and that if their volume needs exceeded what she described, she would not be able to meet them at this time. She showed the draft to Nell before sealing it. Nell read it and handed it back. You're telling a big hotel that you might say no. I'm telling them what I can and can't do. Most suppliers would promise whatever gets the contract. Most suppliers aren't betting the whole operation on whether one bad batch ruins their only account. Mara sealed the envelope. If the Continental needs more than I can give them cleanly, I need to know that before I've committed to it. Nell picked up her pen and went back to the ledger. Your father would have liked you, she said, which was not quite what she meant, and they both knew it, but it was what she had words for at that moment, and Mara accepted it in the spirit it was offered. The answer from August Schell came 2 weeks later. He was a man who apparently communicated the way he likely ran the purchasing operation efficiently, without decoration. He confirmed that the Continental's needs fell within the parameters she'd described. He accepted the price. He asked for a first delivery in March. He mentioned, at the end, that Caleb Wren had described her product as the most distinctive smoked pork he had encountered in 20 years of kitchen work, and that the Continental's dining room manager had been looking for exactly this kind of regional smoke specialty supplier. Mara read the letter at the kitchen table, with her morning coffee still hot. She read the Caleb Wren line twice, not because she needed to read it twice to understand it, but because it was the kind of sentence her father had spent 20 years working toward and never gotten to see, and sitting with it for an extra moment felt like something she owed him. She put the letter in the desk drawer with the others. Then she went out to check on the herd. March came in hard, the way March usually did in that county, 2 warm days that convinced the mud to thaw and the creek to run high, followed by a week of cold that froze everything in whatever position the thaw had left it, including 3 sections of fence that cracked at the post holes and needed immediate replacement before the animals found the gaps. Mara spent 2 days on fencing with her hands, wrapped in 2 pairs of gloves, and still losing feeling in her fingertips by the time she got the posts set, the cold working up through the frozen ground into everything it could reach. Josie helped with the second day of fencing, which had not been part of any arrangement, but which Josie showed up for, anyway on a Saturday morning with her coat, a better coat. Mara had noticed, one that actually reached her wrists, and a practical understanding that farm problems don't schedule themselves around school weeks. They worked mostly without talking, which was its own kind of ease, the comfortable silence of people who have spent enough hours together that quiet is not a pressure. At some point in the late morning, Josie said, without preamble, I got a letter from Whitmore Agricultural College. Mara drove the post driver down without changing her rhythm. And they have a 2-year program, animal husbandry and applied food science. Josie was holding the post steady, her gloves tight against the vibration of each strike. It's in Harmon City. Mara stopped driving. She looked at Josie. I wrote to them in January, Josie said. I didn't tell Mama yet. What did they say? They said my letter was, Josie paused, working to get it right. They said it demonstrated unusual practical knowledge for someone my age. They asked if I'd be interested in visiting the campus. Mara set the post driver down. She pulled off her outer gloves and worked her fingers. The cold was immediate. How much does it cost? More than we have. Josie said it flatly, without self-pity, which was more heartbreaking than self-pity would have been. But there are scholarships and a work program. And she stopped. And Josie looked at the fence post rather than at Mara. I thought maybe, if the operation keeps growing, maybe there's a way I could do some of the work from there. Document things. Help develop the science side. She finally looked up. I know that's not. I know you don't need that yet. Mara was quiet for a moment. The wind was moving across the field, and the sky was the flat white of a day that couldn't decide between snow and nothing. How far along are you in that second notebook? The one with the questions? Josie blinked. You saw that? You left it on the cutting room table in December. It's 43 pages. Mara picked up her outer gloves and put them back on. Tell your mother, she said. Tonight, not later. And bring the notebook Monday. She picked up the post driver. Hold that post straight. Josie turned back to the post, and Mara could see from the line of her shoulders that she was doing something with her face that she didn't want observed. She held the post steady and didn't say anything, and Mara drove it home in 6 clean strikes and moved to the next one. The Continental delivery went out the 3rd Friday of March, packed in 2 crates with Mara's descriptions of the feed and cure process, written out on cards that Josie had printed in her careful handwriting and tucked under the lid of each crate. This had been Josie's idea, not the description itself, which Caleb Wren had asked for, but the card format small enough to fit in a kitchen file, specific enough to be actually useful. It was a small thing, and it was also not a small thing, in the way that certain small decisions turn out to be defining ones. August Shell sent a payment by return freight within the week, prompt and full. He included a note that said the dining room manager wished to discuss a potential exclusive arrangement for the fall season. Mara read the word exclusive and set the letter down. She went to find Nell. Nell was in the record room, a corner of the stone outbuilding she'd reorganized in February into a functioning office space with the ledgers in order and correspondence filed by date, and a list of current soundstand commitments on the wall where everyone could see it. She'd done this without being asked, the same way she'd started writing the invoice drafts without being asked, the same way she'd begun catching errors that would have been expensive to make later. She had turned out to be necessary in ways that Mara hadn't fully anticipated and was grateful for. In the particular way you're grateful for something that turned out to be more essential than you realized. Exclusive arrangement, Mara said, and put the letter on the desk. Nell read it. With the Continental. For fall. That would be... Nell started running figures in her head, which Mara could see by the way her eyes moved. That would be a significant commitment. That's one word for it. What's the other word? Trap, if I'm not careful. Mara sat down across the desk. If I commit exclusively to the Continental for fall and something goes wrong, an animal issue, a bad batch, anything, I've defaulted on an exclusive contract with the biggest hotel on the route. And if you don't commit exclusively, they might find another supplier. They might. Mara looked at the letter. Or they might not if the product is what Shell's note suggests it is. She paused. I need to know which of those is true before I answer. How do you find that out? I write to August Shell, and I ask him directly whether the exclusive arrangement is a requirement or a preference. She looked at Nell, and then I listen very carefully to what he says and how long it takes him to say it. Nell considered this. That's a bold question to ask a purchasing manager at a hotel like the Continental. It's a direct question. Bold and direct aren't the same thing. Mara picked up the letter and read it again. If it's a preference, I have negotiating room. If it's a requirement, I have a decision to make. She set it down. Either way, I need the real answer, not the polite one. Looked at her with an expression Mara had come to recognize as something between admiration and exasperation, a combination that probably reflected living with the realization that this 29-year-old woman had, in the space of 8 months, developed instincts about business that some people never develop in a lifetime. It was not entirely comfortable to be around. Mara suspected, though Nell had never said so directly. She wrote to August Shell the next morning. The answer came in 10 days, which told her something before she read the word. A purchasing manager at a hotel the size of the Continental who needed the exclusive commitment would have answered faster. 10 days meant he'd thought about it, which meant the exclusive was not a hard requirement. The letter confirmed this. Shell wrote that the exclusive arrangement was the Continental's preference, but not a contractual necessity. He wrote, primarily concerned with consistent supply and consistent quality, and if she could commit to those two things, the arrangement could be structured to accommodate her other accounts. She wrote back the same day. She committed to a monthly delivery through the fall season at an increased volume, which she'd calculated was achievable with the expanded herd. She declined the exclusive language. She proposed, instead, a right of first refusal arrangement. The Continental would have the option to purchase up to a certain volume each month before she offered it to other buyers. If they took that option consistently, the effect would be close to exclusive without locking her into terms she couldn't honor. She couldn't honor if something went wrong. She wasn't certain Shell would accept the counter. She was fairly certain it was the right counter to make. He accepted it in 7 days. April arrived, and with it Harlan Creed's 11 sows, delivered on a Tuesday by 2 of his ranch hands in a wagon that came up the hill road in the early morning. Mara walked every animal through the gate herself, running her hands along them the same way she'd done at the auction in September, checking condition, movement, the quality of what 6 months of a different operation had produced. 3 of them still showed the grain supplement in their fat depth, which she'd expected. The other 8 were better than expected, with the kind of body condition that suggests how Harlan's ranch hands had been paying attention to the supplemental notes she'd sent over in February. She signed the delivery receipt and handed it back. Mr. Creed says to tell you the south pasture fence on his upper property got damaged in the March freeze. One of the ranch hands said he was a young man, maybe 20, with the serious expression of someone delivering a message he's been told to get right. He says if you ever need additional forage range temporary lease, not sale, he'd be open to a conversation. Mara looked at him for a moment. Tell him I'll think about it. The ranch hand nodded and climbed back up to the wagon seat. Mara watched the wagon go back down the road. Harlan Creed offering a lease arrangement on his upper pasture was not nothing. His upper pasture ran along the north side of the Oak Ridge and had the same mass quality as her own hillside, which meant it could carry animals at roughly the same conditioning rate. It was not the same as owning it, but it was not nothing. She went to find Josie, who was doing her Saturday morning work in the curing room, and told her. Josie looked up from the temperature log. He's offering you an expansion. He's opening the door. Whether I walk through it depends on the terms. Are you going to walk through it? Mara thought about the Continental's right of first refusal arrangement and the volume she'd committed to and the 60-animal limit she'd identified on her own property and the new math that Harlan's pasture would change. Probably, she said, but slowly. Josie wrote something in her notebook, the question one, not the operations one. Mara could tell by the way she wrote it, the particular angle she held the pen when she was recording something she was still thinking through rather than something she already understood. What did you write? Mara asked. Josie looked up. The difference between capacity and capability. She held the notebook so Mara could see the page. You keep talking about capacity, the hillside limit, the smokehouse throughput, the curing room space. But what I'm trying to understand is whether those limits are fixed or whether they change with the method. She paused. Like, does the juniper work the same way if the forage range is different? Or is it the combination of this specific hillside and the juniper that produces what Caleb Wren described? Mara looked at the question on the page. It was a better question than she'd asked herself yet, which was itself a piece of information about Josie Arden. I don't know, Mara said. That's a 3-year experiment to answer properly. I know, Josie closed the notebook. I think Whitmore would find that interesting. Have you written to them again? Last week. I sent the first 20 pages of the notebook. She said it the way she had said things about the feed records and the Continental letter direct, without the apologetic hedging of someone waiting for permission. They wrote back in 4 days. Mara looked at her. What did they say? Josie reached into her apron pocket and produced a folded letter. She handed it across. The Whitmore letterhead was printed in good ink on proper stationery, and the letter below it was signed by a faculty member named Dr. Ellen Parrish, who held a chair in applied food science and who wrote, in language that was academic in format but genuinely engaged in content, that the questions in Josie's notebook represented exactly the kind of empirical inquiry that her department was looking to develop, and that she would very much like to speak with Josie's family about the scholarship possibilities available to with her demonstrated level of practical research foundation. Mara read it twice. She handed it back. Does your mother know? I told her Sunday. Josie folded the letter carefully. She cried, which was, she stopped. She said Papa would have been loud about it, which is how she says proud. Mara nodded. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that Nell Arden deserved to cry about something that was good, after 3 years of crying about things that weren't. She just nodded and turned back toward the herd visible on the hillside. 56 animals. 60 carrying capacity. Harlan's North pasture potentially adding another 20 if the lease terms worked. 3 buyers, 2 standing arrangements, 1 right of first refusal. A smokehouse running 2 chambers since March, when she'd gotten the second ventilation system rebuilt. 2 employees, counting Josie, though Josie was approaching something that wasn't quite employee anymore and wasn't quite partner, but occupied the space between with increasing certainty. And a notebook in the desk drawer with her father's handwriting going quiet on page 63, and her own handwriting continuing from page 64, and Josie's questions living in a separate volume that was going to end up at Whitmore Agricultural College in the fall. She stood in the April farmyard with the mud soft under her boots and the oak ridge showing the first thin green of new leaves and the smokehouse putting up its blue lines against a sky that was finally genuinely warming towards something better than endurance. The knee was still loud on downhill grades. Her right index finger still didn't feel right in the cold. The work hadn't gotten lighter, it had just gotten larger, which was a different problem, requiring different solutions rather than less effort. She still woke before 4 most mornings with calculations running before she was fully awake, still ate meals, standing up more often than sitting, still found herself in the curing room at 10 at night, checking something she'd already checked twice. But the thing her father had written about on page 37, the specific quality of a farm that has found its right method and is doing work that suits its land, she understood that now in a way she hadn't in September. It was not a feeling of ease. It was the feeling of a machine that has found its correct gear. Still working, still effortful. But the effort producing what the effort was meant to produce every day with the kind of reliability that you had to earn through all the ways it first refused to work. She went back inside to write to Harlan Creed about the lease terms. The letter took 2 drafts. The first was too cautious. The second was direct without being presumptuous, which was the tone she'd learned to aim for in business correspondence, confident enough to be taken seriously, careful enough not to overcommit to something she was still thinking through. She sealed the second draft and put it on the desk for Tobias's Tuesday pickup. Then she put on her coat and went back out to the animals, because it was April and the hillside needed checking and the afternoon light was still good, and there was always, without exception, more work to do. Harlan Creed responded to the lease letter in 5 days, which was faster than Mara had expected, and carried its own signal. A man who takes 5 days instead of 2 weeks to respond to a business proposition is a man who has already been thinking about it before the letter arrived. The terms he proposed were fair, not generous, but fair, which was what she'd asked for internally and what she'd gotten externally, and the consistency between those 2 things felt like a good sign for the working relationship. 60 acres of north pasture, running along the upper oak ridge, where the mast had been consistently heavy for at least the past 3 years, according to what she'd observed from her own property. a per-animal grazing fee paid quarterly with a right of renewal on her side and a 90-day exit clause on either side if it stopped working for one of them. No exclusivity. No complicated language about improvements or water rights that would need a lawyer to untangle. She signed it on a Thursday and sent it back with Tobias. The 60 acres changed the math in ways she'd been calculating since April. With Harlan's North pasture added to her own 80, she could run close to 90 animals total without degrading forage quality on either property she'd mapped. This out over 3 evenings with Josie's help, using the observation notes they'd both been keeping since October to model what the land could support. 90 animals meant roughly 45 to 50 conditioned for curing in a given season, depending on the conditioning rate, which meant enough product to meet the Continental's standing order and the Alderman's standing order and still have margin left over. Margin. That was a word that had not existed in her financial vocabulary 8 months ago. Now it lived in the record book in Nell's neat handwriting, in a column that had started at 0 and was moving, slowly and not always smoothly, in the correct direction. She did not tell anyone in Red Creek about the lease arrangement immediately. Not because she was hiding it, but because she'd learned that the space between a signed agreement and a working arrangement was where things most often went wrong, and she preferred to let results sense and sound themselves rather than making announcements that results then had to live up to. The first animals went onto Harlan's North pasture in the second week of May, after she'd walked every acre of it twice and identified the best access points and checked the existing fence for gaps that needed closing before you introduced 60 animals that had opinions about boundaries. She did this with Josie on a Saturday, the two of them covering the ground methodically, marking fence problems on a rough map. Josie had drawn from memory after one walkthrough. "Your memory for land is good," Mara said, looking at the map. "I remember shapes," Josie said. "Always have. Roy, my father, used to say I could find my way back from anywhere once I'd been there once." She folded the map. He wasn't wrong, actually. They fixed the fence issues over the following week, spreading the work across 3 afternoons after Josie's school hours. A ranch hand from Harlan's operation came by once to ask if they needed additional lumber, and Mara said yes, which she wouldn't have said in September because in September she couldn't afford the social debt of accepting a favor from Harlan Creed. Now she could afford to be practical about it, which was its own kind of progress. The letter from Marcus Webb arrived on a Tuesday in late May. Mara almost didn't read it that day. She'd been in the smokehouse since 5 in the morning, and it was past noon, and she had 3 hours of cutting room work still ahead, and the letter was sitting on the kitchen when she came in for water, and she would have left it for evening, except that the return address on the envelope was printed on paper of a quality that didn't come from county-level correspondence. Web Trading and Supply, Harmon City, Wholesale Distribution. She sat down and read it. Marcus Webb wrote well and briefly, which she respected. He represented a wholesale distribution operation that supplied hotels, restaurants, and private clubs across 3 states. He had been informed of the Voss Hill Farm product by August Schell at the Continental, whose dining room manager had mentioned it to a web trading representative at a trade dinner in March. He was writing to inquire about supply capacity and pricing for a wholesale arrangement that would allow web trading to distribute her product to their network. He enclosed a list of their current accounts. It was 2 pages long. Mara read both pages. Then she put the letter down and looked out the kitchen window at the smokehouse, which was doing its ordinary work in the May afternoon, the blue smoke thin and steady against a sky that had finally committed to something that resembled summer. She picked the letter back up and read it again, looking specifically for what it would require her to give up, rather than what it offered to give her. This was a habit she'd developed over the winter reading proposals backward, from the cost side rather than the benefit side, because the benefit side was designed to be read first, and the cost side was where the real terms lived. What web trading was proposing, multiply her distribution without the time and effort of managing individual account relationships. It would also put a distributor between her product and her buyers, which meant she would no longer have direct relationships with the kitchens buying her ham. It meant web trading would control the pricing to end buyers, which meant she would lose visibility into what the product was actually worth at the point of consumption. and it meant her operation's stability would depend on web trading stability, which she knew nothing about. She put the letter in the desk drawer. She did not respond that week. Instead, she wrote to Caleb Wren. She told him she'd received a letter from Marcus Webb and asked, without explaining why she was asking, what he knew about web trading's reputation in the supply network. She framed it as a general inquiry from someone new to the business. She sent it with Tobias on Friday. Caleb Wren's answer came back the following Wednesday. He wrote that web trading was a legitimate operation with good reach, but a history of aggressive renegotiation of supplier terms after the first year, that several suppliers he knew had entered arrangements with Webb on favorable terms and found those terms substantially revised at the first renewal. He wrote this without apparent agenda, as a straightforward answer to a direct question from someone whose product he valued and whose business he wished to see continue. Mara read the letter at the kitchen table with Nell across from her. "He's warning you," Nell said. "He's informing me." Mara set the letter down. "There's a difference. He didn't tell me what to do, but you know what to do. I know what not to do." She folded the letter, which isn't the same thing. The question is whether there's a version of a web arrangement that doesn't end with renegotiated terms. She paused. "And whether I want to spend time on that question or spend it on something more productive." Nell looked at her. "What's more productive?" Mara thought about the 90 animal capacity and the 2 standing orders and the margin column in the record book. She thought about what the operation actually needed right now, not what it could theoretically add, but what it specifically needed to become more stable, more consistent, and more resilient to individual account problems. "A third direct account," she said. "Something between the Alderman and the Continental in size. Not another hotel. Something different." "Like what?" Mara turned this over. She'd been thinking about the mining camp her father had mentioned obliquely in the notebook, one of the larger operations in the eastern part of the county, which employed several hundred men and ran a commissary kitchen that fed them 3 times a day. The food at mining camp commissaries was generally functional and nothing more, because the buyers prioritized volume and price over quality. But the head of the Carver Mine Commissary, a man named Pete Doyle, who'd been running that kitchen for 12 years, had been mentioned in a conversation she'd had with Tobias 3 weeks ago in a way she hadn't stopped thinking about since. Tobias had said Pete Doyle had been asking around about where the ham at the Alderman came from. "A commissary kitchen," she said to Nell. Nell blinked. "A mining camp commissary?" "The Carver Mine. 400 men, 3 meals a day, 12 months a year." She watched Nell's expression go through its calculation. "Not the whole menu, just one product. Something that makes the commissary food worth eating once a week on payday, when the men want something that reminds them they're people, not just labor." Nell was quiet. "Then that's a consistent order, year-round. That's the point. Can you fill it and still cover the Alderman and Continental?" "With Harlan's pasture, yes, if I manage the conditioning schedule right." Mara was already running the numbers in her head, the familiar arithmetic of capacity and timing that she did automatically now, the way experienced cooks do conversions in their heads without reaching for paper. "It's tighter than I'd like in the fall until the new animals are fully conditioned. But it holds." She drafted the response to Marcus Webb that same evening. She thanked him for the inquiry and declined, citing current capacity limits, which was true enough and professional, and closed the door without slamming it. Then she wrote a separate letter to Pete Doyle at the Carver Mine Commissary, short and direct. She had heard his kitchen had been inquiring about her product. She was interested in discussing a supply arrangement, and she'd be glad to send a sample with the next freight run if he was open to it. She sealed both letters and put them with Tobias's pile. Pete Doyle wrote back in 8 days. He was a man who communicated in the way of someone who has spent his working life feeding people in difficult conditions and has no patience for anything that doesn't address the actual problem directly. Yes. He'd tried the ham at the Alderman on a delivery run to Caldwell. Yes. He wanted to know if she could supply the commissary kitchen with something similar, and what was her price. She sent him a sample the following Tuesday, 2 whole hams, packed in her standard crate with the description card Josie had designed in January. She priced the note at her standard rate. Pete Doyle's response came in 6 days. He accepted the price. He asked for a trial order of 8 hams per month for 3 months, with an option to extend If the men responded well, which he expected they would, because in his 12 years running this commissary, he had learned that 400 miners could tell the difference between food that was made with attention and food that wasn't, and they were not subtle about expressing that difference. Mara wrote the confirmation letter and gave it to Tobias on a Friday morning and stood at the gate, watching the wagon go down the road with the particular feeling of something that has been thought about for a long time finally becoming real. Not triumphant, more like a door closing behind you in a good way, the particular quiet of a decision that has been made and no longer needs to be worried about. She went back inside and updated the supply schedule in the record book and told Nell. Nell looked at the numbers. She ran the margin column forward 3 months. Then she looked up and said, "Without much decoration, Mara, the farm is solvent." Mara had known this was coming in the way you know something is approaching before it arrives. But hearing Nell say it, in her practical voice, at the kitchen table, with the record book open between them and the afternoon light coming through the window, was different from knowing it internally. It occupied more space when it was spoken out loud. "It's been solvent since February," Mara said, which was true but also slightly beside the point. Solvent and functional are different things. Nell turned the record book so she could see it. In February, you were solvent and operating at the edge of what you could maintain. Right now, she tapped the margin column. Right now, you have room. Room. That was the right word for it. Not wealth, not ease, not the resolution of every problem, just room. Space between the edge of what she needed and the edge of what she had. Enough that a bad batch or a sick animal or a broken piece of equipment would be a problem she could solve rather than a crisis that unraveled everything. "Don't get comfortable," Mara said. "I'm not." Nell picked up her pen. "But I'm allowed to notice it." June arrived, and the Oak Ridge went fully green, and the herd on Harlan's north pastures established the routine that Mara had been watching for, the particular rhythm of animals that have settled into their ground, that move across their range with the relaxed, purposeful quality of creatures who know where the best forage is and how to get there without being driven. She walked the north pasture every other morning, now, sometimes alone and sometimes with Josie, watching the animals and making notes and learning, still, things the property was teaching her that she hadn't known to ask about in September. On a Tuesday morning in the middle of June, she climbed to the top of the Oak Ridge instead of following her usual route along the base. It was not a decision she'd made in advance. She'd been walking the fence line on the upper section, and at some point she simply continued upward, through the thinning trees to the crest where the ridge gave out into a broad view of the valley below. She was breathing hard by the time she reached the top. The climb was steep, and her knees registered their usual complaint on the last 100 yards, and she was carrying more weight than the hill required, and always had been, and none of that was different from the way it had been in October or January or March. What was different was that she was no longer apologizing for it internally, which was a shift that had happened slowly enough that she hadn't noticed it happening, until she was at the top of the ridge, looking down at the farm, and realized that she was not having the conversation with herself that she used to have on. Difficult climbs the one about what she should look like, about what someone her size doing this work meant or didn't mean. The conversation was simply gone. She didn't know exactly when it had left. It had left. The farm below her was a working thing. Not a beautiful thing, not the way paintings are beautiful, with their light and their composition and their willingness to leave out the mud and the broken equipment and the patches on the fence line. The smokehouse was a stone square with 2 chimneys, both of them putting up their thin smoke. The pens were functional shapes in the lower field. The farmhouse was gray and solid, and the porch needed repainting, which she'd known since March and still hadn't gotten to. Wagons were visible on the lower road, a delivery going out on today's Tobias run, the Carver mine order, and 2 hams for a new buyer in Caldwell that Caleb Wren had referred to her, a restaurant owner named Mrs. Clara Holt, who had been asking Wren about his meat supplier since March and had finally sent her own letter in May. Clara Holt was the 4th account. She'd come to it quietly, and without fanfare, a letter in Mara's pile on a Wednesday, easy to underestimate because it was handwritten on personal stationery rather than business letterhead. But the letter itself was precise and knowledgeable. Holt wrote about the product in the specific language of someone who cooked professionally and knew what she was tasting, not the language of someone who had heard it was good and wanted to be associated with something good. She'd asked the right questions about supply consistency and seasonal variation, and whether the juniper was a fixed element or varied batch to batch. Mara had written back the same day. 4 accounts: the Alderman, the Continental, the Carver Mine Commissary, and Clara Holt's restaurant in Caldwell. Each one reached differently the hotel accounts through Caleb Wren's recommendation, the commissary through Tobias's freight network, and Pete Doyle's 12 years of paying attention to what good food tasted like. Clara Holt through the particular network of women who ran professional kitchens and talked to each other about suppliers with a frankness that their male counterparts didn't always practice. 4 accounts that represented, on the supply schedule in Nell's record book, close to the full capacity of the operation as it currently stood, which meant she was done growing for now. This was a decision she'd made deliberately, and which had not been easy to make, because there was still room for more orders. Inquiries still came in through Tobias's route, and she'd had 2 more letters from buyers she didn't recognize, which meant the network was continuing to expand on its own momentum. Saying no to growth when growth was available required a clarity about what you were actually building that was harder to maintain than she'd expected. She was building a farm that could sustain itself over decades, not a business that could maximize revenue over seasons. These were not the same project, and confusing them was how you ended up with a hollow version of the first while chasing the second. She'd written this down in the notebook, not as a business principle, but as something closer to a reckoning, the kind of thing you write, because you need to see it outside your head to be sure it's true. It was true. She'd read it back 3 times, and it had stayed true each time. Josie left for Whitmore Agricultural College the last week of August. The exempts had come in June, a full scholarship, work-study program attached, the faculty letter from Dr. Ellen Parrish confirming that the notebook Josie had submitted was being used as a teaching example in the first-year seminar on empirical research methodology, which was the kind of sentence that required Sel to sit down when she heard it. The weeks between the acceptance and the departure were a particular kind of time, full of things that needed doing and things that needed saying, and the constant negotiation between those 2 categories, which is what the last weeks before a significant departure are always about. Mara did not give Josie a speech. She had never been a woman for speeches, and Josie had never been a girl who needed them. What she did instead was this. On the Sunday before Josie was due to leave, she brought the notebook, her father's notebook, the original one, with the cloth cover out of the desk drawer, and set it on the kitchen table. Josie looked at it. "Open it," Mara said. Josie opened it to page 63, where Emmett Voss's handwriting ended. She turned to page 64, where Mara's began. She turned through those pages slowly, reading the way she read everything with the full, unhurried attention of someone for whom information is a serious matter. Then she reached the end of Mara's entries, the last dated page, and turned to the page after that. It was blank. Josie looked up. "The questions in your notebook," Mara said, "the ones you don't have answers to yet. The ones you don't have answers to yet, they need a home that's more permanent than a notebook you're going to fill and replace." She looked at the cloth-covered book on the table between them. "When you find the answers at Whitmore or in the field, or wherever the work takes you, write them in here, with the date and where you were when you figured it out." Josie was very still. "It's not a gift exactly," Mara said. "It's more like a responsibility." She paused. "Don't lose it." Josie picked up the notebook carefully. The way she'd learned to handle the finish carefully, with the specific handle the finished hams with the specific respect of someone who understands that what they're holding is the result of something that took longer than it looks. She held it for a moment. Then she closed it and set it on her side of the table, which was acceptance. "What do I write for this entry?" Josie asked. "Yours, I mean. What would you call what you proved?" Mara thought about this seriously. She thought about the 45 sows in Pen 7 and the auction yard laughter and the failed batches and the frozen mornings and the frozen mornings and the letters from the bank, eating from the midnight mash and the first slice of the first ham and Caleb. Wren writing 4 days before she expected him to, and Pete Doyle's 8 miners per month, and the margin column and the ridge this morning with the smoke from 2 chimneys. "Write that the animals were right," she said. "The land was right. The method was right. And patience isn't a virtue, it's a technique, and it works on things that have been told they're worthless, just as well as it works on everything else." Josie wrote it down in the notebook, in her careful handwriting with the date. Then she closed it again and put it in her coat pocket, which was where Mara Voss had always kept it, and which Mara had not mentioned and did not need to. The fall season ran the way the summer had prepared it to run, not without problems, because there were always problems, but with the particular resilience of an operation that had built its structure around the expectation of problems rather than the hope of their absence. A week of unseasonable heat in September affected the curing rate in the third batch and required Mara to extend the salt cure by 4 days, which pushed the smoke schedule back and required a conversation with August Schell about a delayed delivery that he accepted with more grace than she'd expected. One of Harlan's conditioned sows went lame in October and needed to be pulled from the program, which adjusted the season's numbers by enough to matter, but not enough to threaten any of the standing orders. A section of the smokehouse ventilation system needed replacement in November, which Mara did herself over 2 days, with parts ordered from a metalworker in Harmon City and instructions she worked out from first principles and her own accumulated understanding of how the system behaved. None of these were small problems. None of them became catastrophes. This was the difference between the operation now and the operation in January, not the absence of things going wrong, most of INSEP, but the presence of enough margin and knowledge and working relationship to absorb what went wrong without everything coming apart. She wrote to Josie monthly, letters that were partly operational updates on the herd, the accounts, the seasonal adjustments, and partly the kind of correspondence that happens when two people who have learned to think together are separated by distance and need to maintain the connection in a different form. The same as. Josie wrote back with the same regularity, her letters arriving in batches when the Whitmore mail ran, dense with what she was learning and the questions doctor. Parrish's seminar was raising, and the specific frustration of knowing something empirically and not yet having the scientific vocabulary to describe why it was true. One letter in October said, Dr. Parrish had me present the juniper finding to the full seminar. She called it a documented instance of folk knowledge preceding scientific explanation, which I think is her way of saying your father was right before anyone could prove why. She wants to correspond with you directly if you're willing. Mara wrote back, tell her yes. And tell her the acorn to marbling relationship is the more interesting question. The juniper is the effect. The forage is the cause. And I have 2 years of records. Dr. Parrish's first letter arrived 3 weeks later, addressed in a hand that moved quickly across the page with the confidence of someone whose thoughts outran their writing speed. It was 6 pages and asked 12 specific questions about the conditioning records, the forage composition by season, and the precise cut preparation that preceded the curing. It was the most technically sophisticated correspondence Mara had ever received. And she spent 3 evenings writing the response, pulling the operation notebooks from the shelf to verify dates and measurements she wasn't certain of from memory. It was the most enjoyable 3 evenings of work she'd had in a long time. The first anniversary of the auction fell on a Thursday in late September, a fact Mara noted in the morning without ceremony and which she might have let pass entirely if Nell hadn't appeared in the kitchen at 7 with a pan of something that smelled like the brown sugar cornbread Nell made, only when she considered the occasion worth marking. Mara looked at the pan. It's a Thursday. I'm aware. Nell set it on the table and cut 2 pieces without being asked. You bought 45 sows a year ago today. 45 sows nobody wanted. 45 sows nobody wanted, Nell agreed. She poured coffee. Sit down. Mara sat down. They ate the cornbread without much talking, which was not unusual, known for, and drank their coffee while the morning light came through the kitchen window, and the farm outside made its ordinary sounds animals in the lower pasture, the faint creak of the smokehouse door in the early breeze, the distant sound of the road. What do you think your father would say? Nell asked. Mara considered this. She thought about Mara Voss and his notebook full of careful unfinished observations, his 20 years of ideas that the county had dismissed as eccentricity, the debt he'd died leaving, the smokehouse he'd never gotten to fire at full capacity. She thought about what it was like to be a man who saw something true and couldn't prove it fast enough and ran out of time. He'd want to see the records, she said. All of them. He'd sit at this table for 3 hours going through the conditioning logs, and he'd ask me, why I used the juniper when he'd only mentioned it once, and I'd tell him I tried it on a shoulder cut in November, and it worked. And he'd say, she stopped. What would he say? He'd say that's how you find things. Not by planning to find them. By paying attention to what you're doing while you're doing it. She picked up her coffee, and then he'd probably point out 3 things I could be doing differently. Because that's what he was like. Nell smiled into her cup. He sounds like someone who would have been difficult to work for. He was impossible, Mara said. He was also right about almost everything that mattered. The silence that followed was comfortable in the way that certain silences between certain people are full rather than empty, held rather than fallen into. Outside, a wagon was coming up the road. Mara listened to the wheel sounds and identified it as Tobias Dobbs without looking, by the particular rhythm of the horses and the creak of that specific wagon. She got up to meet him. He had a letter from Dr. Parrish and the October payment from the Continental and a new inquiry that had arrived through Pete Doyle's network, a mine operation, 2 counties east that was asking about supply. She took all of it, thanked Tobias, watched him continue up the road toward the upper farms. She stood at the gate with the mail in her hands and looked down toward the town. She could not see from here, but the way you always feel the direction of a place that has opinions about you. The county had opinions about her still. She was under no illusion about that. The opinions had changed in character from ridicule to something more complicated, a mixture of respect and the residual discomfort of people who had been publicly wrong about something and were still working out how to carry that. Some people managed it gracefully. Others managed it less so. Mara had stopped tracking which was which, because it had turned out to be information she didn't need. What she needed was the same thing she'd needed in September a year ago, to know what she was doing and why, and to do it correctly, and to keep doing it when it was hard, which it always was. She opened Dr. Parrish's letter at the gate, standing in the September morning light. The letter was shorter than the previous ones, 4 pages rather than 6. It reported on the analysis Dr. Parrish's department had been able to run on the samples Josie had sent from the fall batch, which had involved a faculty chemist and produced, apparently, a documented account of why the acorn forage produced the marbling effect that Mara had been observing for a year. It was complex technical language that Mara could follow about 60% of, but the conclusion was clear enough. What Mara Voss had written in his notebook in 1878 about mature forage-raised hogs producing fundamentally different meat was, as Dr. Parrish put it, empirically verifiable and of significant commercial and scientific interest. At the bottom of the letter, in handwriting slightly different from the body, faster, less formal, the handwriting of someone sending something outside the official letter, Dr. Parrish had written, "Your daughter, because that's what Josie seems to be, in the ways that count is extraordinary. I've told her this, I'm telling you as well." Mara read that line twice. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her coat pocket, next to the Continental payment and the inquiry from the Eastern mine. She went back inside. The cornbread was still warm. Nell had left her second piece covered on the plate. Mara sat down and ate it slowly, at the kitchen table in the morning light, alone in the farmhouse that had been her father's and was now hers, with the smokehouse, working out Suicide, and the herd on the ridge, and the accounts in the record book, and the debt fully retired, and the operation running on its correct rhythms. She opened the desk drawer. She took out the record notebook, the current one, not her father's, which was with Josie in Harmon City, and turned to the day's entry page. She wrote the date. She wrote the delivery schedule. She wrote the note about the Eastern Mine inquiry and flagged it for the capacity review she'd do with Nell on Friday. Then she paused. She turned to the back of the notebook, where she kept the longer observations, the things that were more than operational data, less than philosophy, living in the space between the two. She'd been writing these since February, since the first time she'd had enough distance from the immediate crisis to think about what the crisis had taught her. She wrote, Year 1. What I know now that I didn't know in September, the animals that nobody wants are not worthless. They are waiting for the person who understands what they are. The land that everyone calls marginal is not failing. It is waiting for the method that suits it. And the woman that everyone has an opinion about, she is not what their opinion says she is. She never was. It just took a year of everything going wrong, and then slowly right to make that undeniable. She stopped writing. She looked at what she'd written for a moment. Then she added one more line. The hardest part was not the work. The hardest part was continuing to believe the work was worth doing before the work proved it. She closed the notebook. Outside, the smokehouse put its blue smoke into the September morning, steady and quiet and present, the way things are when they have found their right conditions and are doing what they were made to do. The oak ridge above the farm was turning at its edges, the first gold coming into the leaves, and below the ridge the herd moved through the long grass with the unhurried confidence of animals that are exactly where they should be. Mara washed her hands, put on her coat, and went out to check the morning temperature in the curing room because the fall batch was in its second week, and the temperature mattered. And the temperature always needed checking, and there was always, without exception, more work to do. This was not a complaint. This was just the shape of a life that was finally and fully, and without apology, her own.